welcome back to Vital Signs. Today we're talking about muscles. If you're new here, I'm Professor Thomas. I'm here to give you a crash course on all things anatomy and physiology. Let's dive in. When talking about muscles, we have three major categories: skeletal, smooth, and cardiac. We want to pay attention to where these muscles are located, if their contractions are voluntary or involuntary, and what they look like under a microscope slide. So, starting with skeletal muscle tissue, this is probably what you think of when you're thinking of muscles, the muscles that move your body. Skeletal muscle tissue is located all over the body. It is voluntary, meaning you can consciously control those contractions. And under a microscope slide, it will be striated. Smooth muscle tissue is going to be found lining hollow organs. Think your digestive system, think your blood vessels. This is under involuntary control. I can't control how fast I'm digesting my breakfast. I can't control my blood pressure. If we look at smooth muscle tissue under a microscope slide, it is visceral, which means there are no striations. Cardiac muscle tissue is found in your heart. It is under involuntary control. You can't control how fast your heart beats. And if we look at it under a microscope slide, it is striated. Specifically, it has striations called intercalated discs that help electricity to flow really quickly and efficiently through the heart. Our main focus is going to be skeletal muscle tissue today. So when talking about a skeletal muscle, there are going to be three main areas: the origin, the body, and the insertion. The origin is the muscle's attachment to the bone that moves the least when the muscle contraction happens. The insertion is the attachment to the bone that moves the most when a muscle contraction happens. And then the body is that main central part of the muscle. Muscles attach to bone through tendons, which are different from ligaments. Ligaments attach bone to bone. We also have within our tendons bursae. These are small synovial-lined sacs that contain synovial fluid. Let's zoom in a little bit now and look at a muscle fiber. Muscle fibers are made of thick myofilaments and thin myofilaments. Thick myofilaments are made of myosin, thin myofilaments are made of actin. And how these work is they grab onto each other and pull. And by pulling on each other, that is how a muscle contracts. A contraction is just the muscle shortening. So we have thick and thin myofilaments pulling on each other. They shorten the length of the muscle, therefore producing a muscle contraction. The basic functional unit of a muscle fiber is a sarcomere. Sarcomeres are those thick and thin myofilaments, and they're separated from each other by these dark lines called Z lines. So when the muscle contraction happens, the Z lines get closer together. For a muscle contraction to happen, we need two things: calcium and ATP. Now, let's start in the brain and get all the way from that decision to the muscle contraction. We start with a nerve impulse. It travels to the muscle fiber via a motor neuron. Once that signal reaches that location, the impulse is going to trigger a release of calcium. When calcium is released, it's going to bind to those thin myofilaments, and by binding there, it gives actin permission to interact with myosin. We form these cross bridges between actin and myosin, and they pull on each other. That pulling is what produces the muscle contraction. Muscles produce movement by pulling on bones as the muscle contraction happens. But usually to produce a single movement, groups of muscles are working together. We're going to have a prime mover, synergist, and antagonist. For an example, we'll talk about a biceps curl, okay? So the prime mover in a biceps curl is the biceps brachii. That's the muscle primarily responsible for the movement. But if we were to move the biceps brachii, we would find another muscle underneath called the brachialis. This is a synergist, meaning it helps the movement to happen. The antagonist is the muscle that opposes the movement. In this case, this would be the triceps brachii. So for the biceps curl to happen, the triceps brachii has to relax, because when this muscle contracts, the opposite movement would happen, a tricep extension. All of that to say, our primary function of the muscular system is movement. There are other functions to consider as well, for example, posture. Posture is an example of tonic contraction. I'm definitely contracting my muscles when I have good posture, but I'm not necessarily producing movement. This type of muscle contraction is called a tonic contraction. In a tonic contraction, only a few muscle fibers shorten at a time, and good posture favors good body functioning, so sit up straight. Our last function of skeletal muscles would be heat production because we shiver when we're cold. Talking about the neuromuscular junction now. The neuromuscular junction is the connection between the nerve and the muscle fiber that it innervates. So we have three main regions. We'll have a synaptic knob, looks kind of like a doorknob. That is the end of the nerve, and that is where a bunch of neurotransmitters are lying in wait to be released. Then we have the synaptic cleft, which is the space between the nerve and the muscle. And then we have the membrane on the muscle that we are innervating. So for example, nervous signal goes down the nerve. It reaches that synaptic knob. We release a bunch of acetylcholine into that cleft, that space. Acetylcholine binds to receptors on the muscle fiber cell membrane, and that's going to trigger a contraction. What type of a contraction are we producing? Well, there's lots of different types of muscle contraction. Let's start with isotonic contractions. Isotonic contractions produce movement at a joint. So we're changing the length of a muscle. In an isotonic concentric contraction, the muscle is shortening. In an isotonic eccentric contraction, the muscle is lengthening. Most body movements like walking are caused by isotonic contractions. Isometric contractions do not produce movement. So for example, if you're holding something heavy, but you're not necessarily moving at all, that would be an isometric contraction. Or if you're in a door frame and you're pushing on either sides of the door frame, that would be an isometric contraction. There's definitely muscle contraction happening, but the muscle's not shortening or lengthening. We're just contracting it in that way. Moving on to types of movements, we'll start with flexion and extension. Flexion decreases an angle at a joint. So this would be a flexion because this angle is getting smaller. An extension increases an angle at a joint. So this would be an extension. Another example of a flexion and extension would be your head. A flexion of the head would be this because we're decreasing this angle here. An extension of the head would be this because we're increasing this angle here. Then we have adduction and abduction. Let me show you. In an abduction, we're moving away from the midline. In an adduction, we're moving towards the midline. There are some special movements we can do. For example, a dorsiflexion would be moving your foot upward like this. A plantar flexion would be moving your foot downward like this. We also have inversion and eversion. So if I do an inversion on my foot, I'm moving the bottom of my foot towards the midline of my body. If I do an eversion, I'm moving the bottom of my foot away from the midline of my body. A circumduction would be like moving a distal or end part of a body in a circle like this. Supination and pronation. Supination means we're going up. Pronation means we're going down. We've got rotations, which move things around an axis like this. That's a rotation. Now let's get to the bread and butter of this chapter, which is naming the muscles. I'm not going to teach you the name of every muscle in the body, but I am going to point out some really important ones. We're going to start in the face and neck. The facial muscles that I want to point out to you are your orbicularis oculi. This is a circular muscle that surrounds your eye. And then your orbicularis oris, which is a circular muscle that surrounds your lips. It's what allows you to kind of pucker up if you're giving someone a kiss. We also have the zygomaticus. There's a major one and a minor one. That's one of the main muscles involved in smiling. Then we have the muscles of mastication, which is a fancy word for chewing. There are two major muscles of mastication. We have the masseter. This is a big muscle in each cheek, and it kind of allows us to close our jaw as we're chomping. The other muscles involved are your temporalis muscle. If you put your fingers on your temple and clench your jaw, you'll feel that muscle contract. So that's another one involved in that chomping, chewing, mastication motion. Then we have the sternocleidomastoid, one of my favorite muscles. It attaches sort of behind the ear here to the clavicle. This is what allows us to flex our head. So when you pull your head down like that, That is due to the contraction of this muscle. You'll notice it the most if you're like laying down and you try to lift your head. It really pops out of the neck with that movement. Last muscle of the head and neck that I want you to pay attention to is the trapezius. This one's kind of on the back of the neck and it allows us to shrug our shoulders. Moving on to muscles of the upper extremities, we have our pectoralis major. Underneath that is a pectoralis minor. We're going to focus on the major. This allows us to flex the arm. So this type of movement is an arm flexion because I'm decreasing the angle right here. Flexion, and if you put your hand here as you're doing this movement, you'll feel the muscle contracting. Opposite of that would be arm extension, which looks like this. And the primary muscle responsible for that type of movement is the latissimus dorsi. It's the big muscle of the back. So latissimus dorsi does arm extension. We're increasing the angle. Then we have the deltoids. These are our big shoulder muscles. These are responsible for arm abduction, pulling it up like this. If you put your hand on your shoulder as you do this movement, that's the deltoid responsible for that. We've talked about our biceps brachii, the brachialis. These are responsible for flexion of the arm at the elbow, whereas the triceps brachii is responsible for extension of the arm at the elbow. And then moving on to our forearms, there's a lot of muscles here. We're not going to memorize all of the names of them. I just want you to pay attention to the flexors, which are in this area of the forearm, and then the extensors, which are located here. These are going to perform flexion of the hand. So if you move your hand like this, you'll feel these muscles contract. Extension of the hand, you'll feel these muscles contract. So these are our extensors. These are our flexors. These will be really defined on rock climbers. Talking about trunk muscles now, we'll start with the abdominal muscles. We have a rectus abdominis, which is this kind of up and down muscle of the abdomen. Moving out one layer from that, we have the transverse abdominis, which is more of a left to right muscle. Then we have the internal obliques and the external obliques. Our respiratory muscles include our diaphragm. The diaphragm in a relaxed position looks like this. When it contracts, it pulls down and expands the lungs. And then our intercostal muscles, the muscles between the ribs, those play a role in breathing as well. Okay, we are in the lab looking at our thigh muscles. We call these guys our quadriceps. So in front we have our rectus femoris, and then we have three vastus muscles. Our vastus medialis here, our vastus lateralis here, and if we were to remove the rectus femoris, we find our vastus intermedius right underneath that. So 1, 2, 3, 4, those are our quadricep muscles. Those obviously aren't going to be our only muscles of the anterior thigh. Here we have our psoas major and our iliacus, but we'll combine these and call them the iliopsoas to make it simple. That's going to help flex the thigh or trunk. Another muscle that'll help flex the thigh is this one right here. This is your sartorius. Over here, we have our adductor muscles, which will squeeze the leg medially. To adduct is to move medial. And our most medial adductor is the gracilis. After the gracilis, we have our adductor longus here, and then our pectineus here. So all three of those are adductor muscles. Looking at the posterior side, we have our gluteus maximus, pretty easy to identify here. There's also a gluteus medius and a gluteus minimus. Lower than that, we have our hamstring muscles, which are going to help to flex the knee and extend the thigh. We have three hamstrings. Right here, our biceps femoris is our most lateral hamstring. Then we have our semitendinosus right here, and peeking out from either side of that, we have our semimembranosus. Moving lower, the big muscle of the calf is the gastrocnemius. We can see it here and here. When this muscle contracts, it helps you to do a plantar flexion, which is like pointing your toe like a ballerina. On the anterior lower leg, I want you to focus on this muscle right here. This is our tibialis anterior, and this is going to help us do a dorsiflexion, or point this part of the foot up towards the sky. And there you have it, guys. Those are the muscles. Thanks for joining me this week on Vital Signs. I'll see you next time.